Welcome back to the podcast. This episode, we're joined by Mr. Jim Pasieka, former partner with the Calgary law firm McCarthy Tétrault. Mr. Pasieka has practiced in all segments of the energy sector with experience as an officer, director, and chairman of numerous public energy companies. Mr. Pasieka earned an undergraduate degree with distinction and a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Manitoba. Among other things, we discuss 50 years of law practice from Texaco Beginnings to Libyan oil deals and Chinese ventures. This podcast episode is powered by ATB Capital Markets. ATB Capital Markets provides financial solutions and strategic advisory services to help businesses thrive. With a track record of successful deal execution, ATB is a full-service investment dealer with a deep understanding and commitment to the industries it serves. Visit atbcapitalmarkets.com for more information. This podcast episode is brought to you by EPAC, the Explorers and Producers Association of Canada. Good morning, Mr. Jim Pasieka. Thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you, Trevor. Truly, I'm humbled and delighted to be here. Humbled having regard to your past interviewees, and so I'm delighted to be here. Thanks.
For the listener, you are a retired, or I guess not so retired, past partner at McCarthy Tétrault, and you're currently the chairman of Surge Energy, if I'm correct.
Yes, that's right. Have lots of other engagements. Absolutely correct, Trevor.
You're also a big tennis player. So have you been getting much tennis in lately?
No, I've had too many surgeries, and so I've had to give that up.
Like the previous guest, Tom McInnes, big tennis player, I think. I don't know if you guys ever played together or not.
Oh, we did.
Okay.
And the longer it is since we played, the better I thought I was playing against Tom.
I thought I could play Tom too, but I think it would be a bad idea. So
indeed,
probably won't.
Yeah, he's club champion.
Yes.
So he's enjoying his departure from National Bank.
For the purposes of today's conversation, I thought we could structure it roughly chronological. So to begin at the start, you are a lawyer by training, but did you always want to be a lawyer, and how did you get into energy?
Well, I was born in Winnipeg, north end of Winnipeg, and went to school there and university there, and then graduated in 1979 from University of Manitoba Law School and was articling then in Winnipeg, but a number of my classmates were already here in Calgary in the summer of 1979 and encouraged me avidly to come out to Calgary because the streets were paved with gold. In 1979, that was the year of the Iranian Revolution, and so it was a real disruptive event in world commodity prices, crude oil, and prices had increased substantially because of the embargo, Iranian oil. So it was a bustling time in Calgary in the oil business. I came out that summer, poked around, had a few interviews, and then had a little time before departing on my plane the next day. So I made some cold calls, and I called a company called Texaco. Of course, coming from Winnipeg, I had heard of Texaco, and boldly, I made the cold call, ultimately got connected with the general counsel there, whose name was Gerald Palmer, a prince of a man, a terrific man, and ultimately had an interview with Jerry. And again, I was articling in Winnipeg and in Manitoba. And our idea was, once I finished my articles in Manitoba and got my call to the bar there, that I'd come out in the summer of 1980 after my call in Manitoba and come out to Calgary and work at Texaco in the law department, which really floored me, being a guy from Winnipeg who knew nothing about the oil business. And so that was the beginning of the move out to Calgary. And just 3 months and 3 days after starting at Texaco in the summer of 1980, there was an intervention from the federal Liberal government at the time that is still remembered today, and that was the launch of the National Energy Program, October 28th, 1980. And that changed the business forever. And later, I realized, preparing for the questions in the podcast here, how that changed my career as well. But I'll speak to that later. So that's how it all began. And by the way, the National Energy Program was really the beginning of Western alienation. That's where there was taxation at the wellhead called the PGRT, or Petroleum and Gas Revenue Tax. That was a federal tax at the wellhead. And then those monies were made available for Canadian-based companies to engage in activities on what were called Canada lands, which really meant outside of Alberta and Saskatchewan. And that was really offshore East Coast Canada and the Beaufort Sea, for Canadian companies to drill on Canada lands. And the monies garnered from the PGRT would be providing a subsidy to Canadian companies drilling on Canadian lands. And that subsidy was called the Petroleum Incentives Program, or PIP program. And for Canadian companies drilling on Canada lands, they would get 80 cents of every dollar spent on drilling back from the government of Canada. So it was a material differential advantage to Canadian companies.
But to just go back to 1980, before the internet was around, how did you know there was opportunity out west? What led to the conclusion it was a good idea to come out to Calgary? Was it just word of mouth?
Indeed, word of mouth. As I mentioned, a number of my classmates were already here doing their articles after our law school graduation in 79. And it was a bustling place. Calgary was very foreign to me coming from Winnipeg. But like everything else in life, and I guess looking back at my career, if there's an idea and an opportunity, check it out.
So it was word of mouth that you could make good money in Calgary via the oil business.
Yeah, I would say it just a little bit differently. The money wasn't a driver for me, but a job was, and something interesting and different, like potentially a career, as it turns out, in oil and gas, with my first opportunity at Texaco. All of that was really amazing and hard to believe in retrospect. But there's a kid from Winnipeg, North End Winnipeg, who got a job in the oil and gas business in Calgary. And it was an incredible place back then, Calgary. And Calgary is the home of incredible entrepreneurs back then and even today.
Because you could have gone east to Toronto, but I guess it was just job opportunities were more abundant in Calgary.
I had some friends here, as I mentioned, and I think that was a driver. Toronto didn't interest me at all or whatsoever then or now. And as it turns out, Calgary, and I didn't realize how much Calgary is such an entrepreneurial culture. And I think that's correlated to the oil and gas business, which we all know has its ups and downs. And, that's the hallmark of entrepreneurs, is resilience and entrepreneurship. So
you started your career at Texaco via the corporate side. Did you ever think about going to a law firm in Calgary?
No, I am and was interested in business. And there's no better way to, as it turns out, again, in retrospect, in my career, than to have worked in-house. I wasn't interested in that law firm track. I was interested in interesting things. And for me, that was jumping into a business I had no idea of, coming from Winnipeg, and learning and doing. And at Texaco, Jerry Palmer gave me a lot of rope, even though I knew nothing. But I did a lot, and they threw a lot at me, and they gave me a lot of rope. Texaco was an incredible place. It was said that there were 7 sisters of the oil and gas business. And one of those was a Texas-based company called Texaco. And it was a gargantuan worldwide organization. Ultimately, Texaco was sold to Exxon to deal with the litigation that Texaco got into. And the Canadian company Texaco was a liquid asset that could be used to pay the damages in that litigation. But Texaco back then was the hallmark of worldwide oil. It was a global player, a mammoth company, and was called one of the Seven Sisters.
So you had a good job at the time. You were probably pretty happy with that start to your career.
Oh, absolutely. And startled and amazed. And the company itself, Texaco, was incredibly unique. And even today, there's Texaco reunions 50 years later of people that worked there. And many had the same kind of feeling. Now, it was call it a cheap company. They threw nickels around like manhole covers. But it was incredible. There was incredibly smart people at the executive level, and a very shrewd company too, Texaco, and learned a lot and did a lot there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Trevor, what really changed was with the National Energy Program over the next year and a half and two, it really underscored that a company like Texaco, which was U.S. based, was paralyzed and prejudiced materially with this program. Yet, a company called Husky, seen as and was a Canadian company, was disproportionately enhanced because of the incentive programs created by the federal Liberal government under the National Energy Program for Canadian companies. But again, outside of Alberta and Saskatchewan in terms of their drilling prospects. So from Texaco, I was avidly recruited by Husky, and I was reluctant to leave Texaco. And it was, call it a very sad day. And I was sad to leave Texaco for a long time after departing. It was a great training ground and a great, great company with incredible people. I moved to Husky thus in January of 82. And when I moved over, I was the youngest person in the law department, and not just the youngest, but really had only a couple years at the bar at that time. But Husky was an incredibly active company beyond comprehension, really, and under the stewardship of the CEO then called Art Price. And Art, I've had the privilege to work with so many smart people in my lifetime. But if you were to say who's the smartest guy you ever worked for, I'd have to say Art Price. And others were scared of him. I really liked working in his environment, and he himself was incredibly young. I think he was 29 when he became CEO of Husky. Incredibly smart guy. And so he, like his involvement in the business, when he saw Young Turks at Husky, he threw him in the ocean, figuratively, and wanted him to get doing. And there was only a handful of Young Turks that really he identified, not with a pat on the back. It wasn't his style. But I was, I guess, seen to be one of those Young Turks, and others were like, Cal Johnson, Doug Defoe, who later became CEOs in the business. It was a very entrepreneurial environment at Husky. And so I started there in the legal department in January of 82 and did lots and lots of different things. And it was beyond my years, but that's how you learn by doing. And we did so many things there. Then in, I think it was May of 88 or thereabouts, or late 87, Husky took over a company called Cantera. And so Husky became one of the largest oil companies in Canada, again, Canadian. And at that time in May of 88, I was made head of the legal department at Husky, and I was still a kid. And I had 14 lawyers reporting to me, and I think I was 33 years old at the time. So it was an all-consuming task.
So how did you end up in Libya negotiating oil rates, and what led to that?
Well, Husky at the time was looking to really have a stunning prospects worldwide. And at that time in the late 80s, figuratively and literally, there's a war going on. Muammar Gaddafi was in charge of Libya and was for many, many years after that. And he was a lot of things. But in any event, Husky under Art Price was prepared to take the political risk. And Libya, of course, has great prospectivity for oil and gas. And in addition, Art Price would have seen that Husky would have had a competitive advantage because American companies couldn't go there at the time. So Husky came up with the notion of let's invest in Libya. And we had sent technical teams out there, and we identified prospects where we wanted to commit to. And in Libya, that would have been an exploration and production sharing contract that would have been negotiated, but they didn't have any at the time. And we were really the leading edge of that. And so the technical people negotiated some terms, but then the contract was produced and it was terrible. Art Price sent me out there
to negotiate.
And
you're what, like 30?
I think I was 34 in 89. No, I was relatively young. And in the summer of 89, and it was such an incredibly different place. And I again thank you, Trevor, for the podcast, because it caused me to think back in the first 20 years of my career, because the last 25 years is easier to reference. And it was an incredible time. Our co-venturer was OMV in Vienna, Austria, and they were very kind to me, and they put me on the Swissair flight to Tripoli in the summer of 89. And there was no one else on the plane. Again, it was wartime. There's maybe half a dozen of us on the plane, and we landed in Tripoli, but I didn't have a visa, and visas back then would have taken weeks, but strings were pulled, and it was said that a visa would be waiting for me on landing in Tripoli.
To get to Libya, you had to get a visa via Switzerland? Is that how that worked? Or?
Well, Libya would issue the visa, but not many airlines were flying into Tripoli. So that's why Swissair out of Vienna. It was the only flight from Europe to Tripoli because of the war. And so I landed, but the dude that was supposed to be there with my visa wasn't there. And later, I got lots and lots of experience negotiating internationally, and really not a huge surprise, but it was concerning. And I was impressed, so very impressed with the Swissair pilots, because they were very concerned about my status, waiting for my visa. The pilot and the co-pilot were with me in the waiting area, and there was dudes with automatic weapons making sure that I didn't wander away. And the pilots were incredibly caring and empathetic about my visa situation, which I attributed to Swissair service. But after about half an hour to 45 minutes of waiting for the visa that never showed up, the pilot said, "Well, we got to go." And I said to them, "You guys have been incredible. Awesome. Thank you for caring so much. I'll figure it out from here." And the pilot said, No, Mr. Pasieka, we're all going to go. The Libyans have seized our aircraft. Unless you have your visa, you're going on the plane, and we're all going back to Vienna. We're not going anywhere without you, though. If you don't have your visa, you're coming on the airplane. They've seized our aircraft. And just then, just like in the movies, some kind of Harrison Ford movie, comes an Arab guy with robes a-flowing, and he's got my visa waving it in the air. So that got me into the country, and then got into the National Oil Company offices, started negotiating the deal. It was a terrible, terrible piece of paper. And for the first 3 days, the head guy, whose name is Abdullah Al-Salim El-Badre, and that name will come back in a second, was to be the lead guy, but he wasn't there, which, again, in Arab negotiations, that's a bit of a message. I didn't know that at the time, but there was a dozen other individuals there, some from the law department, most of whom did nothing. But that was the deal in Libya, is that you got paid to do nothing. That assuaged any dissension in the ranks. And all of this under Gaddafi. But then El Badre showed up 3 days later, and he just sat and listened. And after an hour and a half, as I was trying to articulate why we needed to change this and how that had a bearing over here and in the deal, he stopped everything and said, let's go right back to the beginning. Let's see. I want you, Jim, to explain all of the changes that we've made to here. And we went back to square one. And it was incredibly difficult because we didn't have any leverage, but we got to grow incredible respect for each other, El Badre and myself, laboring over weeks. And later he became, he was head of the legal department at the time, El Badre, but later he became chairman of NOC, National Oil Company of Libya. And then later he became Secretary General of OPEC. And he's been the largest standing tenure as Secretary General of OPEC over 10 years, over 2 terms, a global leader and not just smart, but a broker of people, and hence his station at OPEC for so many years. He's a legend. He's a legend. He's an icon in the world oil and gas industry. So we connected well. And just one last thing about the trip to Libya and that negotiation. And maybe I'm being too colorful, but the air conditioning, though it was only one hotel for foreigners, I put my key in the doorknob and it came off. Everything was awful. There was no air conditioning. It was the summer. Most people don't realize how humid it is in Tripoli in the summer. And I couldn't sleep because there was no air conditioning. And I came to get into the shower for a couple of minutes, go to bed wet, get a couple hours sleep, and then repeat every 3 or 4 times a night. And during our meetings, there was nothing, again, there was no alcohol. Not that that was a deal, but there was either really strong coffee or Pepsi through the day to keep me going.
Did you get a sense that you were being compensated well enough for all this?
Oh, no. Oh, no. No, it's sink or swim. And we had a job to do. I did. And so just focused on the job. But ultimately, we got out. And that's the phrase that everyone used in getting out of Libya, including El Badre. He would go to Vienna. And because we really couldn't converse confidentially, we'd talk on the phone when he was out in Vienna about what we could do in next steps and pieces of the deal that needed to be dealt with or fixed.
But the point was that there was a lot of oil in Libya and there was a huge opportunity, more or less. Long story short.
Yeah. And we got the deal done. And the commitment from Husky at the time was 80 million USD, which probably is like 250 million today in dollars of the day today. So a big gulp and a lot of political risk for Husky at the time, but it was felt it was worth it.
That's one story from the Husky days. Maybe to fast forward a bit, then you ended up at Sask Oil. How did you end up at Sask Oil?
Well, from Husky, I was made manager of the legal department. And then for maybe 3 years, I worked hard there to hone that department. And as I mentioned earlier, we had 14 lawyers. And that's where I learned the concept you have to add to the top and cut from the bottom. So I worked in the legal department. We did lots of great work. And that's the first time I hired Paul Colburn, to use an example. I hired him not once, but twice. The first time was at Husky. He tells the story a little different than me. But I hired him at Husky and we did incredible things, all of us in the legal department. And then Husky, under Art Price, determined and decided to go into international because there was incredible opportunities internationally for a Canadian company with world-class technology and a Canadian advantage because the Americans at the time were not well considered. So we made forays in international, and a new group manifested called Husky Oil International, Inc. And Jamie Blair was CEO of that company. But Art Price and Jamie Blair wanted someone to make sure things got done. So they plucked me out of the legal department and asked if I'd want to be business manager, vice president international, really doing the deals internationally. So I did that for a year and a half at Husky. However, and this is related to your question, I'll get to that in a second, is that when K.S. Lee and the Hutchison Whampoa took over Husky fully as a private company in January of 92, January 1st of 92 had closed, or was the effective date. The K.S. Lee saw Husky, his investment in Husky, as a Canadian savings bond. He had lots of risk in his worldwide holdings, and he wanted Husky to be a low-risk initiative and venture. So I had been recruited to the international group to build it as vice president international, but with a change in ownership, definitive, K.S. Lee wanted Husky to dismantle international and avoid the political risk worldwide. And so building something is very different than tearing something down, but that's what we were doing. That was our job. And then in there, I was recruited by a headhunter, Michael Honey, to take a job, which turned out to be a Sask general counsel based in Regina. It took me and us a while to get there, to decide to leave Calgary and go to head office in Regina, because that was a mandated requirement. Executive at Sask had to live in Regina. That was a statutory requirement at the time. So it meant moving from Calgary to Regina. And we looked at it, though, as a sojourn at the time. I did. And I hadn't been general counsel of a publicly traded company. I was head of the legal department at Husky, but that was ultimately a private company. And so I took the job and moved to Sask as general counsel.
What year was this?
That was, I think, June of 92.
And while you're at Sask, you meet Neil Rozelle, Scott Saxberg, Paul Colburn, Steve Gianto. I'm sure I've left out somebody, but you met a ton of people at that.
Yeah. And, both at Husky, the relationships that you forge are incredible to my career later. Mm-hmm. And the deals you did also garnered great experience in deal doing and problem solving and fixing. And at Sask, Ted Renner was the CEO, a quintessential entrepreneur, in the same way, very different person than Art Price, but entrepreneurial CEOs. And also Sask was looking to go international. So my background and experience in international was interesting to them. So they headhunted me to go to Regina, and so we did that. And to your mention of Paul Colburn, that leads to the second time I hired Paul, because Paul was back in the legal department at Husky, and I'd moved to international at Husky, but was still at Husky. Then when I left Husky in the international group to move to Sask in Regina, I looked around after a short while and determined we needed help here, because what we had there in terms of lawyers was no good. And so I reached out to Paul, called him from Regina to Calgary, and said, "Hey, Paul, I'm going to ask you something. You have to think about it. You have to think about it a lot, because it's a big deal. You're a close family. You've got connections to your relatives in Calgary, but do you want to come out to Regina, be my right-hand man, and then, in 2 years, you'd have the job as general counsel? I believe it. That's what I want." And instantly Paul said, "Yeah, okay, we'll be there next week." I said, "Paul, you cannot say yes. You cannot say yes. You have to talk to Jan. It's a big deal. You're moving from Calgary to Regina, all your family, which is incredibly important to you. So you have to talk to your wife." Oh yeah. Okay. Well, I'll talk to her. So the next morning at 8 a.m., he calls me and says, "Yeah, we're in." I said, "Paul, did you really talk to Jan?" And he said that he did. And so longer story shorter, he ultimately moved to Regina, and he was my right-hand man there in Regina. But it was a cauldron of entrepreneurs, as you mentioned. And that's where I met Scott for the first time, and Steve and Trent Yanko and Neil Rozelle. And it was a cauldron of entrepreneurs, and in an environment just like in Husky, where it was sink or swim. You were allowed to do a lot of things, and you had a lot of rope. And that led to really an entrepreneurial environment.
This podcast episode is sponsored by Conate Water Solutions. Do you need cost-effective water sourcing options to supply your next drilling or completions program? Conate Water Solutions is a specialized hydrogeology company focused on water well drilling, testing, and water management services in Western Canada and Texas. Contact info at conatewater.com or check out conatewater.com for more details. This podcast episode is brought to you by JSG Professional Services, Canada's trusted leader in pipeline construction management and inspection resources. JSG provides competent, qualified, and verified pipeline construction management and inspection resources, supporting Canada's largest pipeline companies from initial development through final execution. Whether your project involves new pipeline construction, integrity programs, maintenance, pump stations, compressor stations, or inline inspections, JSG has consistently delivered experienced professionals to Canada's energy industry. JSG proudly supports Canada's energy infrastructure with competent, qualified, and verified pipeline construction management and inspection resources. Visit jsginc.com for more information. Did you get a sense that this group of people was above average and really good? Or was it just trying to do your work every day?
That's a good question, because the truth is, at the time, you're just doing what you need to, and you're doing everything you can. And I've said this before, my approach to career and business is work hard, do a good job, and then tomorrow, the very next day, work harder and do a better job. And so at the time, it was a fast-paced environment, both at Sask and at Husky, and it was sink or swim, and I guess that's how I became a long-distance swimmer in both of those entrepreneurial environments. And at the time, you just gravitate to good people, smart people, shrewd people, and I think also at Husky, the young Turks were there, and they had all the work to do, and Sask Oil, the same thing, is that you're given a lot of responsibility, way more than would be the case in a hierarchical organization. Mm-hmm. And the good just got better. All of us did.
So who hired all those people? That's what I always wondered.
Well, ultimately, Ted Renner. Now, in each and every case, that would have been an executive under Ted Renner that did the hiring of all of us. In the case of Paul, I hired him. I was executive, so I had that role and responsibility. But it would have been, and the VPs, given Ted Renner's persona, would have run it by Ted. So it was luck and circumstance, I guess, but the high needs achievers gravitated there.
Right. Was it strange when all those guys started to become CEOs of billion-dollar companies?
Well, it wasn't strange. In some ways, it was kind of a natural progression. And that's in my career. I look back to the incredible relationships and friendships that were forged in the steel mill, the cauldron of deals, and working above your pay grade. And they're all essentially entrepreneurs. And when you're honed in those kinds of environments, that manifests. And I remember all of these startups. And later I did leave Sask Oil to come back to Calgary. And when my son William was going into grade 1, we came back then. And so I was only in Regina for a couple of years. And then coming back, everyone reached out to me that were starting up. And that's how it all happened. It was a culture of entrepreneurs and startups, and back then, capital for the oil and gas sector was attainable. Companies were trading at great multiples. The cost of capital was there. The access to capital, quite importantly, was there. And the environment was obviously and profoundly different than it is today. And so it was a unique time. And others from the United States have identified to me, like Calgary back then was to the world oil and gas business as Silicon Valley back then was to the tech business. Now it's evolved and changed, and tech is all over, and oil and gas business is obviously worldwide. But the entrepreneurs that started back then, and in some ways we all take it for granted, that's what we did and that's what we do. So the way to grow, there's a lot more companies back then, a lot more iBankers, therefore, back then, a lot more deals because there was access to capital. Companies had a cost of capital. And then in turn, that led to what later we knew to be the heyday. But again, it's only after the fact that you can look back and say, that was the heyday and we'll never see that again. And that was the time of, say, 2003 to 2006, October 31st, 2006. That was the heyday of trusts. And trusts were trading at 10, 11, 12 multiple of cash flow, and startup companies were trading at 5 or 6. And so accretive deals could be done. And then furthermore, the trust model was not to drill, but to acquire and do accretive deals because it was a model of distribution to unit holders.
You stayed on the legal side, but did you ever think about starting the E&P company?
Well, I would say that over the years, I like doing lots of different things. As CEO of one company, you're doing one thing, all consuming, or should be. So that was an aspect. I also, in reflection, think I'm a better 2IC than the CEO, and I'm a problem solver and fixer and deal doer. But your question is relevant, more relevant than you know, because when we started Crescent Point, I was identified to be the CEO. Paul wanted me to be the CEO. And we were doing that split and creating mission, and I was to be CEO. But just at the last minute, Paul and I had a conversation, and he said, I concluded Scott would be a great person to run it. He's smart, entrepreneurial, and he wanted to do it. And I think he put a second mortgage on his house to do it, which underscores his belief. And he built that company, Crescent Point, from 250 barrels a day to a multi-billion-dollar company, one of the largest in Canada, through acquisitions and deals. And that was a turning point for me too, but only in retrospect, because I decided it wasn't for me, because I'd have to give up everything else. I'd have to give up all my other deal doing and relationships, and it was a good opportunity for me to do some thoughtful soul searching and say, hey, that's not really what I want to do. I get my juice from doing lots of different things and being all consumed by doing lots of different things and doing deals and being there for lots of other people.
Things turned out pretty well for Crescent Point, so it sounds like it was the right call.
It was absolutely the right call. There's no question that's true. And I'm absolutely the first one to say that.
The trust era. Do you remember the early 2000s when everyone was battling for market share, maybe on the legal side? And did you get a sense this was a unique time in the energy sector?
Your questions are good, because at the time, you're doing everything you can and really wasn't thinking about a unique time. Only in retrospect do you look back and say, that was a incredible time, which unfortunately we'll never see again. That early 2000s to the change in the trust law, October 31st, 006. And so it was a unique time. And to your question about legal and law firms and market share, we had more than we could deal with. It wasn't a battle for market share. It was a battle to get the deals done, because there was deals happening all over the place. And to be blunt and truthful, the sector, wasted a lot of money back then because it was being thrown at us. And there was a lot of deals that were done that were really just financial engineering that didn't last the test of time.
Right. Did you ever meet Marcel Tremblay?
Yes, I did. And he was the first foray into this. Then it evolved, the trust structure.
Him and John Brusa.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Yeah.
So that trust structure evolved somewhat. And in doing deals, we had to solve this problem or issue, which is a bit of a technical problem or issue. Amalgamating companies is so straightforward because there's a statute that provides for that. And you get a court order and it provides for that. Trusts are not corporations. And so how do you merge two trusts? So we came up with angles to do that. Of course, it needs court approval. And we were able to create a structure that passed the first test of a judge's gavel on the bench saying approved. And then that became kind of a model for merging trusts.
Ultimately, the trust law changed. But if it hadn't changed, do you think the trust model was sustainable?
No, it's really, again, too blunt. It was really a fad that became untenable because the government of Canada at the time was horrified because there was a lot of tax leakage. And so while it started in the oil and gas business, it started to promulgate. And imagine that Sked A banks, the 5 of them turning themselves into a trust model, how much tax leakage there would be. So the government of Canada came down hard on Halloween of 2006 and stopped everything in its tracks. There was a lot of music and the music would stop and there was a lot of chairs, but in due course, in my opinion, it was never sustainable because too much money was being thrown around and not engaging in the real work, which is exploration and production. It was a lot of financial engineering. Now, it was a heyday. A lot of people made a lot of money. Unfortunately, investors lost a lot of money, but it was a moment in time for us. We in the oil and gas business in Canada have suffered a lot more difficulties. And so that is an outlier in our oil and gas sector in Canada. Those early days of the 2000s and into October 31st of 2006.
So October 31st, 2006, a Halloween massacre. What were you doing that day? And
we were in the middle of a deal.
So what were you thinking?
Well, we were hoping that our deal would be grandfathered because we had a signed contract that was press released. And we had to delay that deal for months to ultimately to get approval. So we did get that deal done. Ultimately, the deal that got halted on that very night, but it obviously had a material effect on the whole business in that the access to capital really started to dry up and the unusually robust multiples started to constrict. Deals became fewer and fewer. However, what is incredible about our oil and gas business based out of Calgary in Canada is how resilient the entrepreneurs are. And if you suffer a blow, then get up, dust yourself off, and get back to work. Resilience. That's probably a hallmark of entrepreneurs in my view. And so we found ways to come around that. Now, the heyday was over. You had to earn your cost of capital, but we went back to drilling and deals, but deals that were based on midterm and long-term objectives as distinct from, I'm going to say, and I'm again being too blunt or candid, short-term financial engineering objectives.
And you could see that at the time.
Absolutely. The cost of capital and the access to capital dried up immediately until there was workarounds seen and done. But that heyday was over. And again, it became a lot more disciplined approach to M&A.
Mm-hmm. But REITs still have the trust structure. Why did they let real estate go and not oil and gas?
It's grandfathered, and there's probably a lot more influence in Ottawa for the REITs than there is in respect of royalty trusts in the oil and gas business. But in addition, so the REITs came before the royalty trusts in the oil and gas business and continue today. But it's the promulgation of this concept that the government of Canada at the time, and it was a conservative government at the time, recognized that it was getting to be, and it was rumored that one of the major banks, one of the Sked banks, was considering the structure, rumored. And that put a halt to it and a halt to everything. There was no grandfathering in the oil and gas business, even though that was that became the model of other businesses turning themselves into a trust. And it became a model that others outside the oil and gas sector started to copy and promulgate. And the government of Canada at the time put a firm halt to it because there was so much tax leakage, certainly tax deferrals.
Okay, before we get into the art of the deal and being a good lawyer, then you went back to being a partner at law firms after Sask Oil, I think. What led to that decision? You left corporate.
Left corporate. When we moved back from Sask Oil in Regina to Calgary, Sask Oil wanted me to continue working on a number of their projects. So I took that and used that at the beginnings of call it a consulting business. The moment I left, I was sought out to do some deals in China. So after leaving Sask Oil, and it was really a question of the physical move from Regina to Calgary, I kept a lot of Sask Oil work. It had changed its name to Wascana by then. And I had other work from other clients. And so I was doing deals in Trinidad with Wascana. We were selling a marketing business in Columbus, Ohio. And that was a difficult deal. And then I was approached to do a deal in China, which turned out to be the first onshore oil and gas deal that was ever done in China. MOFTEC, Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Corporation, Certificate 0001. Wish I'd taken a photo of that.
Yeah.
And what that was transferring our Canadian technology to the sagging oil fields in China with re-entry horizontal drilling out the casing and sidetracking the existing well to access parts of the reservoir that were untapped. We were doing that in southeast Saskatchewan, and that's before horizontal drilling per se. It was the beginning of that approach to access more of the reservoir horizontally. And so re-entry horizontal drilling, and of course the cost would be less, and also in that context, there would be no fracturing of the reservoir, but you would access reservoir elements that had been untouched. So Chinese side believed that to be a great thing for their sagging oil fields onshore. So it was a company called Lateral Vector that engaged me, and they're a negotiated and very, very, very tough deal with the Chinese side. But we're the only one to ever get an onshore deal approved by MOFTEC, Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Corporation. There's a big signing ceremony and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, nothing really ever worked out because there's a lot of aspects to it and cultural aspects. In order to be successful, you need to get the best wells to engage in this procedure. And Chinese side didn't want other side necessarily to succeed under their watch in the local oil fields. The overall state did, but we never got good wells to re-enter. They kept offering us wells that were marginal at best in their own accord. So the initiative never really worked out, but we did the deal, and I learned a lot and did a lot and traveled to China probably 13, 14 times. And back then in China, my first trip in November of 92 was incredible to Beijing. It's nothing the way it is at all whatsoever. It's a different planet. Back then in 92, there was literally millions of bicycles on the street and a handful of cars. And it was the season for harvest, so There was dudes in wooden carts with their cart filled to the top with cabbages and vegetables, pulling the carts on the road. There was dentists on the street with a drill doing dental work. It was an incredibly different city and country than it is today.
So you were at the law firms until McCarthy Tétrault?
Well, then my kids were just young then, and it was time to get a real job. So Code Hunter and Greg Turnbull reached out, and so I did some of this work while I was at Code Hunter, but my engagement at Code Hunter Whitman, which was an incredible a law firm with incredibly smart partners there, they let me do my own thing on these other initiatives that are already on the go, because that's what I wanted to do. And so we structured an arrangement that was unconventional at Code Hunter. And then later, the law firm of Heenan Blakey reached out to me. Mike Black was the lead partner there. Heenan Blakey was building an office in Calgary. That was a Montreal-based law firm and Montreal-Toronto-based law firm. And they were starting a presence in Calgary. So they had recruited a handful of principals or partners to beachhead the company, the firm's initiative in Calgary. And that firm, Mike Black, specifically reached out to me. And I ultimately came over to Heenan Blakey. And I started there and resurrected all these relationships. And I was a partner there for 10 plus years.
So that takes us to when? What year was that?
Well, that would have been kind of circa 2012, 2013 at Heenan Blakey. And regrettably, things changed at Heenan Blakey from, I'm going to call it the old days under Roy Heenan, who was an incredible man and master and was really the glue that kept everything together. And as he, for health reasons, had to take lesser and lesser roles, things started to happen that were bad business practices came in. And I was on the executive committee, and I really wanted us to succeed at Heenan Blakey, even as the firm morphed with Roy needing to step down as chairman. He really was the glue guy, and more than that. Like I'll stop and just pause. When I reflect on the incredible world-class people I've had the privilege of rubbing shoulders with, it's a gift from God. And Roy Heenan was one of those. And as the firm started to go the wrong way, it's a basic business, and your revenues, your real revenues, captured revenues, have to exceed your expenses. And it was going the wrong way. And and I'm known to be blunt, maybe candid, but really I'm blunt. And we needed to change that ship. And in 2012, Greg Turnbull, who was then a lead partner at McCarthy Tétrault in Calgary, reached out to me to recruit me to McCarthy Tétrault. And at that time, in the summer of 2012, I declined because we were trying to turn this around, and I was loyal, and my wife would say to a fault, and staying there at Heenan Blakey for that next year to try and turn it around. But practices didn't change. And I forecast at Heenan Blakey quite grimly, and persons there would have declared to me to be really deranged. But it was not that difficult to foresee that, the firm would run into financial troubles. But no one, to a large measure, there were only a handful of persons who felt the way I did, who are partners on the executive committee. And so when Greg Turnbull in the stampede of 2013 reached out to me again, but this time it was different for me, because I'd spent a year trying to turn it around and change the perspectives of the executive committee and the co-managing partners. And when that wasn't happening, I had different perspectives a year later, A, and B, McCarthy also had different perspectives at that 1 year later. And Greg Turnbull's a great guy and a sharp guy and a shrewd guy. And Greg said, okay, Jim, this time we're doing it. We met on a park bench on 8th Avenue. Okay, this time we're doing it. Just tell me what you need and we'll make it happen. You just tell me what you need. And I thought about it and I talked to my key colleagues at the time, which was Tom Cotter, who's now vice chair of the Securities Commission, and Mark Franco, who's now general counsel and vice president at Paramount. But they were my friends and key colleagues. And they said, well, you decide. If we're going, we're going. And so we all left as a group. We had each different deals and with McCarthy. And so we all moved over August 31st, 2013 to McCarthy. And McCarthy Tétrault also evolved over time, but I was there till August 31st, 2023.
Well, that's a really high level summary of the last maybe 10, 20 years. So probably could tell a lot more stories, but maybe for the purposes of this podcast, we'll get into the art of the deal and what makes a good lawyer, if that works for you. So like I said earlier, you were recognized as top lawyer in Canada by Canadian Legal Expert Directory and best lawyers in Canada. So you have had some experience on this subject. What to you makes a good lawyer?
I think you need to pay attention to your clients and their needs and understand their business. Maybe that's not a protocol that's often followed, but you need to be a value-added individual as a lawyer. And over time, as I said, I was in sink or swim environments and I learned a lot. And I became a marathon swimmer, therefore. And, that's the experience that comes with that. And, in my case, the relationships are forged, as I said, in the steel mill of the cauldron of entrepreneurial companies like Husky, like Saskoil at the time. And so you got to make real connections with people, and you need to be a value-added provider of advice and a trusted advisor.
From the legal side, what is the biggest value add that you've noticed through the years?
You really need to understand the business. And so in my case or career, again, I was so fortunate to work 14 and a half years at the beginning of my career in-house in first Texaco, then Husky, and traveling the world and doing deals on 6 different continents. And then later, the first 14 and a half years, I learned the business in-house. And that's a rare privilege. And then I started with law firms. And so I was able to hit the ground running, not just as a legal practitioner, but I knew the business. I had the relationships, again, forged in the steel mill, the cauldron of those entrepreneurial environments. And at the end of the day, though, I think it's really fundamental that lawyers understand the business that they're in this case, the oil and gas business. And I encourage young lawyers to, as I mentored many lawyers over the years, I bring them into the deal. And one or two are reluctant and happy to work as a backroom lawyer, but that's not the right deal. The right circumstances to get in the front row. And when I could, I always brought them into the boardroom because that is an enlightening experience. And that's where you can learn the thrust and parry of what's going on and the business contemplations and that go into the boardroom decision making, and thus be a better lawyer, in my opinion.
What's the hairiest deal you've seen? Maybe that one in Libya?
No, oh my, no. No. That the attributes of that deal were hairy and difficult for sure. But there's been lots of those type. You made mention of my great friend Tom McGinnis. Well, over time, when he was still at National Bank and then beyond, we'd compare notes. And because Tom has been involved in so many deals too, and he's incredibly value-added investment banker. And so we compared notes and about our 3 worst deals ever. And totally independently, like Trevor, you write it on a piece of paper and then you literally move your piece of paper across the table, and our 3 worst deals are the same. And it's not appropriate to make mention of them, We won't make mention of them, but one key to those three most difficult deals is the CEOs. In one, we had to fire the CEO in the midst of a 3 merge. And in the other two, the CEOs were, unless we did that deal, weren't going to be there. So that I'm on the board and making that declaration from the board's perspective. So the deals were to save the company on a transaction, M&A transaction. But without that, we were in the process of terminating the CEO. So all of those deals, those 3 deals were the most gnarly deals we've ever been on. And what's fun and interesting is that his 3 worst deals are my 3 worst deals and vice versa.
This podcast episode is powered by Broadbill Energy, the local midstream company that puts producers first. Broadbill Energy does things differently and doesn't just move energy. They are moving the industry forward. While others take a cut, Broadbill shares profits back with their customers because when Broadbill customers win, so does Broadbill. With a producer-focused approach, Broadbill specializes in the gathering, processing, and transportation of oil and gas, ensuring safety, reliability, and maximum value for the people who actually produce the energy. If you're tired of the same old midstream model and want a partner that works for you, it's time to talk to Broadbill. Visit broadbillenergy.com to learn more. This episode is brought to you by Astro Oilfield Rentals. Planning your next drilling or completion site or budgeting for an upcoming construction project? Astro has your remote communications and accommodations needs covered. With over 25 years of experience serving Western Canada, Astro continues to expand, innovate, and deliver the best value for your investment. Astro offers a full range of communication solutions, including cell towers, radios, and internet services. Astro's lineup features well site trailers, sleepers, full gym units, medic centers, and custom-built command centers, helping you stay connected and comfortable in even the most remote locations. Visit astrorentals.ca for virtual tours and more information. Best deal you've seen financially?
Well, that was Result. That was Brett Herman. I think we were there in existence for 7-8 months. And we got an approach to be taken over at what was 7-8x. And we took it. And so that was a great deal for shareholders of Result at the time, of which we were material shareholders because we had just recapped that company. And we hadn't even had time to change the name of that company. That was to be our starter kit, a recap. But as it turns out, we were approached and we sold for great value. And again, that was a great turn, 7-8 months in existence.
How important to you is it to be win-win in a deal?
Personally, I don't think any deal transacts or is durable for the participants unless it is. Now, there'll be different elements where you can take advantage of certain leverage and negotiations you might have. But at the end of the day, the deal has to be consensual in order to transact. So that's why the win-win. Maybe you don't get the price you're looking for, but there are strategic reasons to transact. And conversely, hostile takeovers, to use an example, where a third party approaches a public company, those are few and far between. And the last one I can remember that I was involved with is 25 years ago. And they ultimately work something out with the other party as you look for other, call it one, white knights. But that is, in my view, the hallmark of everything is that at the end of the day, if it's a contract like in Libya, signing a exploration production sharing agreement for the first time, or whatever the transaction is, you're signing a contract, which means you all agree. And in order to get there, I really think you need to approach it as a win-win.
If you were to look back on things, have you found there to be value in doing win-win just to preserve the relationships for that one day down the road when you guys have to work together again?
No, that's not a driver. I wouldn't say that's a driver. You do have respect for counterparties here in the city, but at the end of the day, you're driven by your fiduciary duty if you're on the board or an executive or even as a trusted advisor. Many of these deals, I've probably been on 3 dozen boards, public company boards in the last 20 years. So I'm also driven by the fiduciary duty there as a director.
You've been around for a while. You've seen people come and go, companies come and go. Through the years, have you learned to recognize red flags in people and or companies?
Yes, absolutely. And I also, again, I speak of privilege. Over the last even 2 decades or at the 2 law firms, I have the privilege of when it doesn't feel right and I'm approached, I find a way, and I'm going to say an appropriate way, not to be involved. Because over the years in this rough and tumble world of international and elsewhere, you pick up signs and signals and you can spend a lot of time in business development, but if you're barking up the wrong tree, then you're wasting your time. And it's important to spot those danger signals early so you can disengage or not engage at all.
Is there one red flag that sticks out for people?
I think there's multiple. And I think even if you don't know the person, there's ways that you get to understand them. And there's many that want, your involvement or credibility or experience. But it's a experience and a skill set that I recognize now that it's an important one to ferret out the ones that are going to be, if not a dumpster fire, really
just a waste of time,
wasting time on something that's not going to manifest. Yeah. And a trick I use for persons who are approaching me and saying, we're going to do this and this and that, and I'd say, excellent. So we need to do such and such before moving on, and that's affirmed. And the other party says, yes, that's exactly right. I said, tell you what, when you get that accomplished, which, by the way, we both agree needs to be seminal, then let's get back to me. But they never get it. They never get that. They'll still call me and say, oh, I said, hey, yeah, but what about that? Have you done that? Have you achieved that? Well, we're working on it. I said, oh, for sure. Call me when you get it done. So in other words, you put it on them to do something, to accomplish something. And if they don't and can't, then that's your reason not to engage further, but in a wholly professional and appropriate way.
Well, we're at an hour now. Maybe to bring the conversation towards the end to get to nowadays, a couple questions on Surge and some current events, if that's okay.
Sure, please.
So how did you end up as chairman of Surge Energy?
So we had a CEO at Surge and that company's been around for a while. In 2010, our CEO, Dan O'Neill at the time, was having certain health issues of a material kind. And so we needed to find a CEO. I was on the board and Paul Colburn was on the board. And unfortunately, live, I reached out to Paul and said, why don't you become CEO? And so Paul did. And then I don't recall us having necessarily a chairman at the outset at Surge, but then for the annual meeting in April of 2015, Paul Colburn is CEO of Surge and also board members, because it's a board decision to be chairman, and it just happened organically, and I was asked to be chairman and I agreed, and remarkably, it's 10 years later.
You own a good chunk of Surge shares. Have you felt it important as the chairman to own shares in the company to skin in the game?
Oh, I think that's a good question. And I would say that is my format, win or lose. And there's been as many losses as wins. But I think you need to be invested as a director, not just as chairman. And if you're, irrespective of whatever policies might be in place for directors' ownership, which only is a regulatory thing or a disclosure thing that's come out over the last years, I think it's important to be aligned with your client in that way. And so I've always taken material positions sometimes to my detriment.
Yeah, but that's the point.
I made mention of result. And by the way, Trevor, I'd also say that even though some might have all the trappings of a win, sometimes you don't. It's important to be materially invested and aligned, therefore.
Some companies, the chairman's a figurehead. At others, you're not really sure who's running the show. In your opinion, what balance do you strike at Surge? How hands-on are you?
I think chairman is a nexus between management and the board and management. So if I see issues manifesting at the board level, in the case of Surge, I'll engage with Paul, and then vice versa. If Paul wants to engage in certain matters with the board, I might be involved in that job. So I see the chairman as a nexus between board and management and board. And I see it as, generally speaking, not an active role unless there's problems or issues manifesting, in which case it can be all consuming and intense. And, I've been chairman of a whole number of different public companies and private companies. So whatever I say in respect to the context of Surge applies. That's how I view the chairperson's role.
To what degree do you feel Surge is undervalued in an unrecognized public equities market nowadays?
Well, let's face it, I made mention of the heyday wherein small companies, juniors, intermediates would be trading at 6.5 times multiple. And those are the heyday. And today we're trading at 2.5 times a good company. And in those earlier days, the heydays I mentioned, debt was used to leverage equity returns. And 1.5, 2 times multiple of debt to cash flow was seen as in the fairway. Today, you got to be 0.5 to 1 debt to cash flow, and multiples have contracted, and that, this business is capital intensive, and you need access to capital and a cost of capital to grow. In the case of junior and intermediate companies in the old days, you needed to spend more than your cash flow in order to grow, because growth was rewarded. And that meant access to capital, equity capital, generally, to exceed your cash flow in order to spend more to grow. That was a model back then. Today, that's not at all the model. The model is return excess cash flow beyond your drilling requirements to the shareholders one way or another. That is the model of public companies in the oil and gas sector, both in Canada and the U.S. Now, these days. And multiples in Canada have contracted to career low multiples. And that has a lot to do with, now I'll stop and articulate, of course, this is a commodity business and commodity prices fluctuate. And we have always seen high prices and low prices in the commodity and have, as entrepreneurs, been resilient to work around that and manage that, because that's a part of the business, part of the commodity business. In Canada, differentially, we've been prejudiced with, 9.5 years of the federal Liberal government policies that are actively hostile to the oil and gas business. And I would also say unprecedented for the last 45 years. And the two Trudeaus, Pierre Trudeau and Justin Trudeau, are bookends to the annihilation of the oil and gas business. Different reasons. At least the first Trudeau had a plan. The second Trudeau's plan was to annihilate the business under the Trojan horse of climate change, but really it had to do with certain other things like politics. I'm told that half of the contributions to the federal Conservative Party come from one city, not one province. And that city happens to be where we are, Trevor, today, Calgary. And so to voce, that is really an approach. And there are no votes for the federal Liberals in Alberta and Saskatchewan, so there's nothing to lose. So I know that sounds cynical, but I I know that to be the truth.
Yeah. So if cost of capital has been hit hard lately and M&A strategies are not being rewarded in the markets, what do you think the best strategy is for companies nowadays on the public markets?
I think we're destined to live this situation where we have to endure the low multiples, and deals still have to be accretive. So that's why you're seeing M&A really dry up. In addition, in the heyday, there were many more companies, and with many more companies, there were many more iBankers, and access to capital was there. But no one wants to invest in the Canadian oil and gas business. I underscore Canadian, under the nihilist regime of the federal Liberal government. And that is not a comment made lightly from an insider in the Canadian oil and gas business. That is what is said worldwide. Americans aren't coming here until there's a change in government federally, which in turn will change the nihilist policies of the federal Liberal government. So we're constrained until there's regime change to live within our means, distribute our cash flow, and reward shareholders with dividends and share buybacks, but live within our means. At Surge, to use an example, as a public company, we're always looking for accretive acquisitions, but we're incredibly highly focused on our two core areas. And so any acquisitions will be laser focused on in those areas. And we are at Surge, to use an example, we're having great success in Hope Valley and also in the Frobisher in Southeast Saskatchewan. So we're showing great results at Surge. However, the financial engineering component isn't there anymore. It's steady as she goes, and work boots and work gloves and hard hat on.
If you were to think long term, do you do the deal anyways, knowing that eventually your cost of capital will return, or do you just wait?
You'd be annihilated in the public market if you did a deal that was not accretive. However poor your cost of capital is, it'll just get worse. And also it's incredibly dilutive to existing shareholders.
Right.
So
it has to be a good deal.
It has to be a good deal. It has to be an accretive deal. Otherwise, if you stop and think about it, if you do a deal that's dilutive, you're causing your business to go under, because you're diluting your existing shareholders who in a public company will flee, and your share price will get even more depressed. So that's the discipline. So, it's an interesting comment you make, because it provides for management of public companies to be incredibly disciplined in their acquisitions. And, Whitecap buying Varen, used to be Crescent Point. The stock price was crushed at Whitecap at first, but it'll come back.
Yeah, they're a great company.
They're a great company. Grant Fagerheim is an excellent executive. But that was an accretive deal on cash flow to Whitecap, and the consolidation strategy for high-cost wells like that made sense.
Do you think further consolidation is required in the sector?
Our sector is really diminished in terms of public companies, remarkably so. There might have been 50, I'm just making that number up, junior and intermediate companies and others, startups. That's because there was access to capital. Today, there's no access to capital. Startups are few and far between. With Scott Saxberg, we started a private company. When I say we is the success has many fathers, so that's why I insert myself there.
Yep.
But it was really Scott. We found a deal, incredible deal, that became the foundation of that company. And then we had the collective we had an idea for the Bakken and how to approach the margin or the fringe as it was seen in a different way. And that's multi-leg laterals without fracking. And so the water doesn't come into your wellbore and make it uneconomic. And also, obviously, the cost of those wells are much less because there's no fracking needed. So you morph, and like running a small private company for experienced entrepreneurs, like at Cash Island, I think I can speak for all the shareholders, and I'm happy to be chairman of Scott's company. I can say that we're doing great, and I would say more, but I'm not sure I could say more or should. But we're doing terrific. We're distributing, 7-figure dividends to shareholders. So there's a way still to make money in the oil and gas business, but you have to have people that know what they're doing running it. And that's Scott and his team there at Cash Island.
What advice would you have for a new entrepreneur in the sector that maybe doesn't have the track record or the capital behind them that Scott does or you do? What would you say to someone that's looking to start out nowadays?
Be careful. Do not laden yourself with debt. And there still is underappreciated assets, but they're smaller and fewer and far between. And you have to kiss a lot of frogs to find a prince. And so it's a very different business, and you have to have also some unique ideas on how to approach the business.
To bring it towards the end, maybe?
Yes.
Advice to a 30-year-old Jim Pasieka. What would you tell him?
Well, I jotted those ideas down, and they're ideas that have been inextricably intertwined in my career, and no one ever told me this, but it's just how it was. And one idea I give to new lawyers, and it's incredibly simple, so simple that persons say, well, that won't make a difference. I say, hey, go to the client's office. And persons today would say, well, we don't need to do that. We got email, we got Zoom calls, we got email. We don't need to actually see the client. Go to the client's office. You'll see your client in their own landscape. And in the old days, I would say that I would come back with more work than I went to engage in the first place. And guess what? Simple. And as a young lawyer, guess what? And this is remarkable. You're already in the 90th percentile if you do that with the client. Reason? No one else does it. And for the lawyer to actually go to the client's office is unheard of and remarkable from the lawyer's point of view, but we're talking about the customer's point of view. And they go, wow, that guy or that gal or that firm, guess what? They cared enough to come to our office, and it's a demarcation event, simple, that is so very different than anyone else's perspective. I think also I'd offer this advice. In a deal, think about the other side, whatever time and effort you devote to thinking about your side and the deal points. Multiply that by 10 or 15 or 20, thinking about the other side. And the reason is because the problems will manifest. It's like a 3D chessboard. And in a deal, you have to manage the issues. But if they percolate to an issue, then you get entrenchment and difficulty. But if you foresee, if we say this, then they're going to say that. And then we're going to say that. And here's where we want to end up. And with experience, you know that and you see that. That's a piece of advice which I know a number of my mentees have followed, and they think it's remarkable, and yet it's so simple. Think about the other side a lot more than your own. And another thing I'd comment on for young lawyers is that the common practice is if we're in a deal, and Trevor Rose, if you're to produce the initial document, what you would do is look at a bunch of precedents inside your firm's data bank and elsewhere in the public data bank and come up with precedents and work from precedents. Well, I encourage persons not to do that. That's always there. I'd say first and foremost, think about the deal, what you're doing, what are the deal terms. And once you've got that identified and cemented in your knowledge, then look for ways to put a document together with precedents. But otherwise, you're looking to put a square peg in a round hole. If you say, I got these precedents, I'm jamming them together, you're not thinking about the deal. You need to be thinking about the deal. And then maybe one last thing is get involved in the business. Understand your client's business. And I mentioned earlier that I seek to try and get my mentees in the boardroom. And even if you can't get into the boardroom, get involved in board work, a volunteer board, and understand a lot more about how the business works. Now, in my case, I've had the privilege of working in-house for 14 and a half years at the beginning of my career. So I know the business inside and out before I became a partner at first Heenan Blakey and then secondly McCarthy, each for kind of 10 years or thereabouts. So that's know the business, understand your client's business. So that's how I would conclude.
I really appreciate your time today.
Well, thanks a lot, Trevor. Again, I repeat, it's been a privilege and it's a humbling experience, and I thank you.
Well, I really appreciate it. And just a quick shout out to Tom McInnes for connecting us. Unless there's anything else you want to add, we can end the formal conversation there.
Yeah, thank you again, Trevor. Thank you.
Hello, listeners out there. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Hopefully the episode provided some insights. If you enjoyed the show, check out trose.ca where more episodes are yet to come. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.